Senate Bill 539 by Senator Glazer and Act relating to public property.
Senator Glazer.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Our public buildings should be named for people of great accomplishment who are role models of high morals and principles. Unfortunately, some places in California still honor Confederate leaders who attempted to break America in two in order to protect their right to enslave black people. Along with memorials and street names named for Confederate leaders, there are two schools named for Confederate General Robert E. Lee. I don't want to erase their names from our history books. I just don't want our children looking up to people who fought to preserve a system that treated human beings as chattel. That's the basis for SB 539, the Frederick Douglass Liberty Act. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a truly historical figure in his activism against slavery. Just a few months ago, members, we memorialized 9 churchgoers in South Carolina who were killed by an alleged person who wrapped himself in the battle flag of the Confederacy. This legislation is not an answer to systemic racism that permeates American society in far too many places. It simply shines a light on some overlooked examples here in California where we are celebrating traitorous leaders, even those who led what could be considered honorable lives before or after the Civil War. Unfortunately, we've allowed the names to remain in our midst for generations. It's as if we've forgotten the history, forgotten what these Confederate leaders stood for. There are some who would like to revise history. Some claim the Civil War was waged over the concept of states' rights rather than slavery. The Declaration of Causes of the seceding Southern states, which I have here in my hand, contains 72 references justifying their actions based on the defense of slavery. 750,000 Americans died in the fight, a fight about whether America's clarion call for liberty applied to all people, not just white people. We need to remove the names of Confederate leaders from a celebrated place in our public signs, schools, and public buildings. Thank you. I respectfully request an aye vote.
Members, debate or discussion on this item? Debate or discussion? Senator Nielsen.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, do not take this lightly. And if anything, this is revision history. Just because of contemporary feelings, you're just going to wipe out some very important individuals who are a part of the history of this country. We may have objection with them, but if we're going to add to that list, I submit there's a lot bigger list of objectionable people that we should include removal from, not just leaders of the Confederacy during the Civil War. You know, the Civil War was a great trauma in the history of this country. But it ended up affirming the unity that we feel for each other in how both sides came together after the Civil War, including with the participation and support of a lot of those same leaders that you want to purge from our history books and for our streets and our roads and our buildings now. They stood for rebuilding the country after that very difficult war. I fear if we're going to get to the habit of doing these kinds of things, our own version of revisionist history, we're going to be doing a disservice. Even if those individuals you did disagree with, it is well that history knows what they stood for. And then the successors of all of us can make their own judgments. We are not imposing our judgments on their view of history, denying them the true and complete view of history. I urge a no vote.
Senator Hall.
Yes, I stand in support of SB 539 by my colleague, Senator Glazer. If you recall, just last year, we passed another resolution and we were in front of the nation, or a bill in front of the nation that banned the sale of Confederate flags on state properties. However, it gave opportunity for Confederate flags to be placed in museums and in books and things for educational purposes, but not on our public streets where individuals who supported and participated in hatred and bigotry and the very things that tore this nation apart, and still today where blacks and minorities are being held accountable for things that were done in those times. I believe that this bill is a good measure, a good step forward in the right direction to reclaim justice and liberty for all in this great state, by the way, which was not part of the Confederacy. And so I stand in support of this bill, SB 539, by Senator Glazer, and ask for my colleagues to do the same.
Members, additional debate or discussion? Oh, Senator Anderson.
Members, I don't think there's anybody on this floor that supports slavery, and certainly we've had plenty of votes since I've been in the Senate on human rights, and we've all joined together. Didn't matter which party you were from. Everybody was concerned about human rights, and I think that that's where we are today. I want to vote for this, but in the same token, I don't want to change our history, because I think that what we've gone through as a country makes us stronger today. I'm more concerned about where we are today and moving forward and what we find acceptable in what we don't find acceptable. And unfortunately, I don't believe I'll be able to support it today, because I think it's revisionist history on one level. And I still haven't worked it through in my head all the way. I'm not for slavery. I'm not for promoting those values. But I'm also talking about the 1800s, and I'm also talking about history. Not everybody that fought for the South was for slavery. They were for states' rights. They were for the 10th Amendment. And I don't want to confuse the slavery issue with the 10th Amendment. And I can't speak for every person that did that. But, you know, we have a huge history. And I'm afraid that if we start picking and choosing what we're going to allow to be told, if we start thinking about how we're going to control the way people think, as opposed to talking and opening them up to our history so they can understand what happens when people aren't well educated on these issues and they don't respect human rights. So this is a very difficult vote for me, but I just don't think I can get there, because I'm worried that we're going to head down a path where the next legislature after I leave is going to redo the history that we have today. I urge a no vote.
Thank you. Senator Huff.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I rise in support of this bill. I'm a co-author. It's not a difficult vote for me. You know, it's not revisionist. It's not picking and choosing. It's a matter of moving on as a nation. You know, I was going through some photos over the weekend that I took last year when visiting my son in South Carolina. And on that visit, we went by the Capitol, and there was flying the Confederate battle flag. And I found an anomaly that, you know, all this time later, they're still flying that. But even they have moved on, and that flag has come down. And it's time we in California, who were not pro-South during the Civil War, but it's time that we just respect that there was an outcome to that. It was a very ugly time in the state's, in the nation's history. It is still a festering wound for some, and it's time to put that behind us and move on. And of course, I said we don't pick and choose, but the winners have always dictated what names go on the public buildings and thoroughfares, and this is no different. But we've had over 100 years, well over 100 years, to heal as a nation, but it hasn't. And so it's time for us to do this simple step. This is not, you know, rocket science, but it is moving forward on the best foot. I urge your aye vote.
Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tomorrow is September 9th, and it's Admissions Day for the state of California. And Secretary of State Alex Padilla has been handing out this flyer on the floor this morning, this afternoon. And I had the privilege of serving on the Sesquicentennial Foundation for the state's 150th anniversary. And what you learn is that history is not pretty. The state has a lot of history that is awkward. We've had Indians that have been impacted. We've had Mexico impacted. We've got a lot of history that maybe isn't all that pretty. And so I'm sitting here kind of struggling because Orange County was populated by people that came after the Civil War that were on both sides. And we have streets and buildings named after a lot of former individuals that served in the Southern Army. The war is over. The war is over. I get some of the issues, but maybe it's time to exercise a little grace. I'm having a little difficulty with this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Bell.
Yes, in point of history, I'd like to point out that Senator David Broderick of California was killed in a duel in 1859 in fighting over slavery. And we have his bust right over here. His bust is right here. This is the bust. And I believe that this is a pertinent issue to talk about. I think that these issues are very important for schools as where young people are. So therefore, I urge support of this. I think I would do that a disservice to our senator, our colleague of the past, if we didn't vote for this bill. I urge an aye vote.
Members, additional debate or discussion on this item? Seeing and hearing none, Senator Glazer, would you like to close?
Thank you. Thank you, members, for the thoughtful conversation on the floor this morning. I want to say a couple things. Number one, this measure does nothing to change our history books. Not a word, not a paragraph of any history book here in California. It simply says that if you were a Confederate leader whose purpose was to break the Union in two, to defend slavery, that you should not have a place of honor on public buildings in California. That's all it says, a place of honor. Doesn't change who you were and what you did and the choices that you made. It simply says that we get to make choices about who we recognize, who we give a special place. When our kids enter that schoolyard, who do they look up to? Who do they want to follow as great examples of leadership as they decide their path in life? And it is true that we do not have very many examples of where we have Confederate leaders in a place of honor in California. That's a good thing. There are very few examples that this bill will affect. And I think one of the positives about this conversation on this legislation is the conversation that we've had here on the floor. It's an uncomfortable one. It's an uncomfortable one. But understand this, members, at the heart of that debate, it wasn't a political issue, it wasn't a Supreme Court decision, it wasn't a measure in Congress. It was about the right of states to enslave people against their will, to enslave them, to take the principle of America about liberty for all and apply that to all, not just to some, who we consider to have 2/3 of a vote, who we could move around and enslave and imprison and enchain as if they were cattle. That was the question that our country faced. And that's why so much blood was spilt on our battlefields on that question. And it wasn't a small question, it was a big one. This bill does not change history. It simply says we're going to make a choice about who we want to recognize. And in closing, I want to recognize my co-sponsor from Los Angeles, from the other party who joined with me in this bill. I want to thank my seatmate, Senator from Los Angeles, who's guided me in working on his example that he set last year on the issue of the Confederate flag. And with that, members, I ask for your aye vote. Thank you.
Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen. Anderson. No. Bates. Bell. Aye. Berryhill. Aye. Block. Aye. Cannella. Aye. De Leon. Aye. Fuller. Gaines. Aye. Gaggiani. Aye. Glazer. Aye. Hall. Aye. Hancock. Aye. Hernandez. Aye. Hertzberg. Aye. Hill. Aye. Wesso. Aye. Huff. I. Jackson. I. Lada. I. Leno. I. Leva. I. Liu. I. McGuire. I. Mendoza. Mitchell. I. Monning. I. Morlock. Morrell. Wynn. Nilsson. No. Pan. I. Pavley. Roth. I. Runner. Stone. I. Vidak. I. Wachowski. I. Wolk. Wolk, aye.
Call the absent members.
Allen. I. Bates. Fuller. Mendoza. Morlock. Morrell. Wynn. Pavley. I. Runner.
Ayes 31, noes 2. The Assembly amendments are concurred in.